Hi everybody, my name is Ed Friedman. I chair Friends of Mermaid Bay. Thank you for coming. Before I start my big spiel, I want to get this going around here. I want to thank Patagonia for sponsoring this event for many years. Cost us well over $1,000 to put the series on, and what they do is provide some sort of a nice product from the store to act as an incentive for a door prize. So if you'd like to be eligible for a drawing for this, there's been nights with better odds, but still, we need your help. Piece of paper in here, write your name on it, put it on the cute teddy bear tin, put $5 or something in a basket, and we'll have a drawing. And Art or Leith, who's ever the last man standing, will pick a winner, at the end. So, for those of you that, actually, first let me say, I was here last night. Friends of Casco Bay had a program on ocean acidification, and they had about 120 people in the room. They set a high bar. We're pretty close, I think. I'm not sure we're quite there, but I'll count it up when I'm filming. But thank you all for coming. For those of you that don't know, we are a unique organization. We engage in research of the sort we'll hear about tonight. We just finished up an update on aquatic vegetation change and land use habitat changes, upland habitat over time, going back to the 1950s. We have done a current study, animated buoys drifting all around the bay, get a sense of what the bay does and how well things drain or don't drain. Animated, it's on our website. We are a land trust, protected well over 1,200 acres of land around the bay. Work with different partners to do that. Landowners, conservation easements, some things are purchases. This land you'll hear about probably tonight was a purchase over a number of years, protected from subdivision. We have an active education program in schools, and most of what we do involves a lot of volunteers. If you like what we do, please come up to me afterwards or fill out on the sign-up sheet. There's a slot for whether you like to volunteer or not, and someone will get in touch with you. But one of our premier events is May 14th. It's a spring bay day, and we're going to have over 200 kids from mostly fourth grades around the bay out on the shore of the bay at sort of the super power spot, Chop Point, the bay, where everything empties out. And we'll be doing lots of hands-on stuff, bird walks, watershed modeling, beach seining for little fish. Normally we have an archaeology dig there, lots of fun stuff, and the kids are having a blast. They're getting away from their devices, and they're getting dirty, and they're having fun. So, education, research, excuse me, land conservation, some great advocacy, mostly around migratory fish restoration, but also around toxics issues. Been working really hard this last couple of years with partners and Friends of Sebago Lake on the Presumpscot River. And what's happening there is a shame in that that's still a dammed up river after all these years. There was fish passage at all the dams there in the 1880s, and there's basically none of it now. And anyway, so some of the threefolds here, some information on the table. Afterwards, help yourself to some cookies and juice over there. And let me just introduce our speakers, and actually, while I remember, before I forget, this is the, what day is this? Second Wednesday of each month is when we have the series, generally. And next month will be a great topic, wireless, wildlife, and you. Most of you are aware of it. We're seeing an increasing number of wireless proliferation, amount of wireless proliferation, whether it's cell phones or smart meters or what have you. These are emitting radio frequency radiation. There are some major effects to wildlife from this as well. And we'll have an expert in that area talking about that. And then we have sort of a bonus event this year. Normally, that will be the last session for the year. We're going to host the end of May on a Thursday, not Wednesday, May 30th. Camilla Fox from Project Coyote will be here, and she's going to be doing a Maine premiere of their short film, Killing Games, Wildlife in the Crosshairs, about the way we're treating predators in this country. Should be really good, be followed by a discussion. So that'll be Thursday, May 30th. Art Spiess and Leith Smith over here. Art's a senior archaeologist at Maine Historic Preservation Commission. The lights off, so I can't read anymore here.
That's good enough, Ed.
Yeah, so PhD in anthropology and from Harvard, and we've worked with art over the years quite a bit, and protecting different areas around, and partnerships with Maine Historic Preservation over the years, often involving Land for Maine's future funding, where they are obligated to come out and do at least a phase 1 survey for the site. Sometimes it turns into more than that. Leith is sort of ARC's counterpart in the realm of historic archaeology, and has done a lot of field work in Africa. And you've been here for, what, about 4 or 5 years now?
Just a few, yeah,
Like that.
12
But a lot of work in the Boston area. So keep it short and sweet, and there we go. All right? So thank you.
Thank you, Ed. I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this without the microphone. If you can't hear me, raise a hand or something. Ed's recording this, and there's another two. If we get 2 microphones going at once, it's going to cause a bit of a stir. So tonight's a presentation, an update on our work at the Dresden Falls Archaic site last year. There's a good story in the acquisition and the protection of the site, which we presented to FOMB members in 2013. We don't need to revisit that, except to say that with Ed and the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay playing a leading role, the Land for Maine's Future program and the Archaeological Conservancy were all instrumental in saving a major archaeological site from being a subdivision, which was proposed at the time. The site is located a few miles north of here on the Kennebec River, on the east bank of the river opposite the north end of Swan Island. There are 2 main types of occupation on the site. Here's the site. Here's Richmond. 2 main types of occupation. The prehistoric occupation, dating between 9,000 years ago and about 4,500 years ago, covers the entire field. Here. It's probably a key to understanding this time period in Maine, about which we know very little. The Euro-American occupation, which begins before the American Revolution, would likely provide some depth to the story of Fort Richmond and the Euro-American settlement on the lower Kennebec and Leith. Smith will bring you the news on that, on our historic archaeology part of the dig later at the end of the lecture. This site is huge compared with most Maine archaeological sites. The field has a lower level or terrace here and an upper level or uphill portion up here with north to the right. The upper terrace has some Native American use on it with stone tool debris, but the uphill portion near the tree line is the center of the Revolutionary War era historic occupation on the site. So you will hear us talk about upper terrace versus lower terrace, and that's basically a division between the Euro-American and the Native American occupation. Our 2018 dig follows the application of ground-penetrating radar to the site in 2013 and 2017 with some interesting results. Here you see a bunch of excited Bates College kids on the lower terrace. I use the word excited advisedly. But more importantly, looking north behind them, you can see the uphill portion, the upper terrace portion of the site. As a thank you and acknowledgement, the ground-penetrating radar work in 2017 was funded by Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, and our archaeological field and lab work in 2018 is also funded by Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, the Merrymeeting Bay Trust, and with the Department of the Interior Historic Preservation funds from my office, our office. So please stay tuned for the next 45 or 50 minutes. I'll speak first, and then Leith will follow with the historic archaeology discoveries. Why do we call the site the Dresden Falls Archaic site? Well, archaic, the word archaic, is the archaeological period before the adoption of ceramic or pottery cooking vessels and before the invention of birch bark canoes, and that applies to this time period on the site. So people traveled on foot or in dugout canoes at this time, which were not portable. Today there are no falls on the Kennebec River until about Augusta, well, what used to be Edwards Dam in Augusta, and now Waterville. This portion of Upper Merrymeeting Bay is tidal now, as most of you know. So why is this a Dresden Falls site? Relative sea level has been rising since the end of the Ice Age. It was much lower. At the end of the Ice Age, sea level was about 200 feet lower than it is today. It's been rising ever since. There had to be some reason for the intense, presumably seasonal, Native American occupation on the site that lasted for 4 millennia, 4,000 years here. Our initial work on the site a decade ago found lots of burned animal bones from plowed up hearth features, including lots of bone from very large fish. We looked at the topography of the situation, realized that there's a very narrow channel here, very narrow channel here. Here's the site and this bedrock control point and Little Swan here. So there's a very narrow channel in here. On the east side of Swan Island. Based on post-glacial sea level rise along the Maine coast, between 9,000 and about 5,000 years ago, Merrymeeting Bay was a freshwater swamp and marsh complex. And the freshwater Kennebec rushed down the channel here. Looking at the bedrock on the bottom of the Kennebec River on the underwater contours here, there is a plunge pool where the bottom of the Kennebec River, the bedrock bottom, drops about 30 feet between here and here. The Narrows, and probably a bedrock sill between Goodwin Point and Little Swan Island, created one of the more spectacular falls on the Kennebec River before it was flooded by sea level rise. We know from Fort Halifax and Winslow today, in Waterville, that such falls are the places where anadromous fish congregate: striped bass, sturgeon, salmon, and maybe shad and alewives, whether or not they can get above the falls. Until 20 years ago, the site was an actively farmed field, and the farmer's name was Hoodlet. There are a large number and variety of stone tools picked up from the surface of the field. Again, here's the site here. It covers about 12 acres. There were a lot of surface collections, artifacts picked up from the surface of the field when it was plowed by avocational archaeologists, but Mr. Hoodlet did not allow professional archaeological digging on the site. The surface finds include many spear points dating to the time period between 9,000 and roughly 4,500 years ago. And we can date these things by their shape, and in some places these shapes have been radiocarbon dated. So we've got a pretty good handle on what time periods are represented. There are all sorts of other beautiful stone tools that go with this time period, which was basically a warm period after the Ice Age. It was slightly warmer than the climate is now, more like southern New England than the modern Maine climate. Who were these archaic people with only archaeological names for their cultures? Well, we don't know. They may or may not have been related to the modern tribes. We don't know what language they spoke, and so forth. If you ask me who were these people, I'll give you a shrug for an answer. Unfortunately, well, we can get into more details afterwards, maybe if you have questions. We do know that similar or related cultures extended from central Maine south to Pennsylvania, to the Chesapeake Bay, and to the Carolinas. But the Dresden Falls Archaic site people were local. In fact, they used local river cobbles for their stone raw material. And as I've said, they used dugout canoes, and they did not use pottery for cooking. So they're culturally related to people further south along the Atlantic seaboard, but they were local residents who spent their whole lives here, probably. We do have some information about what is below the plow zone from Historic Preservation Commission archaeological work during the acquisition of the site. Originally working with the aborted subdivision development in a power line trench. There was testing done in 2008 and 2010. Below the plowed ground layer, which is about a foot deep, are the bases of many Native American garbage pits and fire hearths. I'm pointing to two here, these dark stains in the wall of this power line trench. Recovered charcoal, calcined or burned animal food bone, and stone tool making debris or flakes out of those two features, and we got a radiocarbon date of 6,130 years, which is about 5,000 years BC in calendar years. The discarded food animal bone on the site is all burned because fresh animal bone does not preserve in Maine's acid soils unless it's been burned or unless it's buffered with shells, for example. It is rare to have a large sample of food animal bone from an inland site, and there is a very large sample from the Dresden Falls Archaic site. Much of it is large mammal, and one that can be identified as white-tailed deer. Remember, the climate was warmer than it is now. White-tailed deer. There's also beaver and turtle, as one would expect near a freshwater wetland. But the vast majority of the bone is from three species of large fish: salmon, Atlantic sturgeon, and striped bass. This particular bone here is a modern 8-pound Atlantic salmon vertebra backbone, and this is a quarter section of an Atlantic salmon vertebra from the site. So that is twice the size of the 8-pound modern salmon. And if you do the math, it probably came out as about 30-pound Atlantic salmon. The striped bass are also very large, and of course they're very large sturgeon in the river then as now. A woman who's a local expert on, actually she's a nationwide expert on charcoal, happens to live here in Maine. Nancy Ash-Seidel examined and identified the charcoal samples from one of these pit features. Tree wood species include maple, birch, hawthorn, beech, ash, hornbeam, oak, elm, and white pine. Sounds like a southern New England forest or something south of what is now in central Maine. There were a few pieces of acorn, but no other nutshell. At least for the seasons that people were using the site, nut harvesting was not a focus of their economy. Fishing was the economic focus. The time between 9,000 and 4,500 years ago was, as I said, slightly warmer, and there was a freshwater falls there, which attracted probably a huge fish. It's a great place to catch fish. These folks are here on a seasonal basis to stock up their food supply. Remember, this time was thousands of years before the invention of clay or ceramic cooking vessels. And yet we find burned clay scraps at the site. This one here being the best one. This is all different images of the same piece of burned clay. It seems to be a piece of clay with grass or plant fiber impressions on the exterior. See all these little, it's like somebody squashed clay into some kind of a grass basket or container. And on the other side might be what I'm guessing might be fish, an impression of fish skin. So I think that some of their cooking might have been done with clay and baking the fish in pits in the ground. Also, I suspect much of the fish was dried and smoked for later use. Before the ground penetrating radar study and the 2018 dig, which I'll get to into a minute, we suspected also the presence of one or more historic houses or farms on the site based on a map that was made just before the Revolutionary War and some bits and pieces of historic artifacts that were found, especially on the upper terrace. I'm not going to steal Leith's story, but to introduce you to the concept that the historic stuff will be coming later, I wanted to show you this map. So there's probably a mid to late 1700s farmstead on the site. Here's Goodwin's Point that narrows between the site and Goodwin's Point and Little Swan Island, and here's the field where our dig was. So, for the record, until last year, archaeologists had excavated about 25 square meters. Excavated and tested about 25 square meters on the site. Maybe examined another couple dozen meters, maybe a total of 40 square meters. This was on a site that covers 12 to 14 acres. So we had looked at about 0.05% of the archaeological site. We basically, discussing the issue with Ed over years and years, last couple of years, decided that the next step before further excavation should be some kind of ground penetrating radar or other remote sensing study to see what other types of information we could get from below the ground surface. There were 2 rounds of ground penetrating radar work. A trial run in 2013 down here next to the garage, and then 2 areas in 2017, a big area here and a small area up on the upper terrace. The work was done by Dr. Alice Kelly, Andy Heller, and Jackie Miller from the University of Maine in Orono. In 2017, the really serious GPR work on the lower terrace was done looking for archaic Indian features in the ground, and on the upper terrace we were looking for the Revolutionary War settlement. So let me spend a few minutes explaining what ground penetrating radar is. Ground penetrating radar does in fact see below the ground surface, but there are lots of ifs, ands, and buts to that. Radar waves, which are electromagnetic, are transmitted into the ground. The radar waves pass through most of the material in the ground and return or bounce off. Differences in density or really noticeable difference in materials in the soil. The GPR unit itself is called an antenna. The antenna is mounted on some sort of sled that allows the antenna to run right over the ground. The antenna has to be more or less in contact with the ground, which is important. That means that vegetation has to be low and pliant. It doesn't work too well in a forest or in brush. It doesn't work at all. Grass, such as a mowed lawn or field, as at this site, is the best. The sled that the Maine uses looks a lot like a baby carriage. Kind of, really. High-wheeled or a high-wheeled lawnmower. And GPR antennas come in several frequencies. The higher frequency, the smaller the object, and the shorter the distance you can see into the ground. The antenna used by Maine is, I think, 500 megahertz, if anybody's interested. And it seems to have a practical limit of about 2 meters in depth, 5 feet, 6 feet, something like that. And it can see rocks and cobbles about the size of a football. The best resolution is done by running the GPR back and forth at a half meter or 1 meter intervals. The machine likes to run in straight lines, so running the machine back and forth feels an awful lot like pushing a lawnmower back and forth. Back and forth, back and forth. And like a lot of archaeology, it's work and it's not that exciting. except that the operator has to pay attention to a little screen, a little computer screen on the machine there, set up on the handlebars. The GPR is computerized. An integral computer does the basic storage of the data. It stores gazillions of bytes. I don't know exactly how many gigabytes or terabytes in a big project like this. One can see some really obvious things on the little screen in the field, but most of the information comes from computer processing back in the lab afterwards. The output of this process, even after initial computer processing, is a black and white and gray pattern that looks to me like the mother of all Rorschach tests. And a computer in the lab, the experienced GPR data person then tunes out a lot of interference, increases or decreases contrast, plays with various digital filters, and can come up with a two-dimensional map set for a specific depth, such as this upper thing here, or a cross-section looking through the ground on a specific line slice. So here's the ground surface, and the radar waves are bouncing off of something down on the ground. There's skill involved and artistry as well as science, and I'll address that subject more in a few minutes. So this is what Maine generated in 2017 that sent us back into the field in 2018. Archaeological testing of radar interpretation is called ground truthing. The upper terrace data in 2017 are actually so clear that even I can see it. There are lines that run these black lines that run through the pattern northwest, northeast to southwest, and it looks like there's something crossways here. And the ground penetrating radar people at Orono imposed this little red outline. It's actually about 5-8 meters across, and they said, we think there's a historic house there. Okay, that got our attention. Here's our testing plan for the lower terrace. The blue box, by the way, here. Sorry. This is one of our test pits from 2008. So we had some preceding information there. We already knew that there are pit features and fireplaces there. The radar interpretation that they came up with says that there are these large circular things that, by the way, this is a 10 meter, the distance between A2 and A3 is 10 yards, 10 meters, 30 feet. So this here is a 20 by 20 meter box, and each one of these round circles is 3 or 4 or 5 yards across. That's what they came up with for interpretation. They said, we're seeing some circular things in the radar here. So we intended to strip off the plow zone and cross-section any of these things that we could find, and we concentrated on this area. Now back to the upper terrace. This was our plan, was to dig one of these blue boxes or something like it and intersect what we were anticipating was a Revolutionary War house. And this is the lower terrace where we wanted to cut across at least one of these round things and maybe find a Native American house. Cleaning up, so we're back on the upper terrace, cleaning up the bottom of the 8 to 10 inch plow zone. Revealed sterile subsoil, this yellowish stuff here. And when we got down into cleaned up the bottom of the plow zone and the yellow stuff was well exposed, we found a bunch of plow scars, the bottom of one of the deepest plowing episodes on the site. So when the plow cut through the sod, This was the deepest it got, and that's what's left. And I didn't orient this correctly, but there's nothing else there. This is sterile subsoil. There were a bunch of artifacts in the plow zone and these plow scars. So what the ground penetrating radar picked up here, at least going this direction, are those plow scars. It's sensitive enough to pick up the difference in the soil moisture content between the plowed ground and the subsoil. It was a big disappointment. And Leith backfilled that test area quickly and went on to other stuff, and they'll tell you about what was a major success in a few minutes. So we got the heck out of that spot, and we turned our attention to the lower terrace where we thought there might be this Native American house. We laid out our dig area. This wall here goes right through the middle of what that interpreted circle was. We began with a Maine Historic Preservation crew, Friends of Merrimack Bay and Maine Archaeological Society volunteers who did a lot of the shoveling and the screening of the plow zone. And on the lower terrace, we recovered handfuls and handfuls of stone tool making debris, calcined and burned bone, all of it bagged by 50 centimeters square from the plow zone itself. And then we carefully scraped down the bottom of the plow zone, looking for these darker patches that are the bases of Native American pits or other features. And all these little white, see these little white things there? Those are little plastic numbers that we stick in the ground to denote which feature is which. We troweled the subsoil carefully, and then we found approximately 14 smaller pit and fireplace base features in an area of about 8 square yards. So it was really intensively used, and these sort of overlapped in places. The bases of some of these pits, there were single fire-burned rocks or small piles of river cobbles. I think we're looking at the remains of some of this cooking technology that I talked about, where people may have set a fire in a pit in the ground and then cooked fish or something in the pit afterwards. Heated rocks were part of the process, but there weren't a lot of them. In any case, we're going to learn a lot about the site and the archaic people from our dig. Good old archaeological shovel and trowel work, not the high-tech GPR stuff, because what we found was 14 of these individual features in this little block area, and that's how our dig area underlaid the ground penetrating radar predicted big semicircular Indian house feature. There's no such thing there. The ground penetrating radar cooked up something that's fanciful. I think what it did was it picked up a bunch of these features that sort of lie on the circumference and created a circle in the computer mind. So we'll provide our detailed maps to the Orono radar folks and try to find out why that happened. Maybe we thought there was something deeper and we had misinterpreted the sterile soil at the bottom of the dig. Nope, not so. We dug a trench along the west wall of our dig here. That's looking at the west wall. We dug down to 60 centimeters, about 2.5 feet. You can see the plow zone really well. This is where the farmer's plow stopped, this darker layer on top. Just below the darker layer of these in this wall are undug fire pits and Native American features that extend into the wall. We dug part of this one, for example, in our dig, and left the remainder in the wall. So that's a really good picture of what's really in the soil. And you can clearly see where the plow came along and zipped off the top of this Native American fire pit and threw some of the dirt sideways. So we went even deeper. We put in a bucket auger hole going down 4 or 5 feet from the bottom of our trench, assuming that maybe there was something else down there. Nope. We hit layers of sand, sterile sand, silt, and then we hit gravel at about 7 feet depth below the sod layer. There's no archaeology at all below the bases, the bottoms of those fire pits that are in the wall here. So we got a heck of a lot of data. We got a tremendous amount of information from the dig, but it has nothing to do with the ground penetrating radar results. And we did it that way on purpose, so we get some information, a lot of information, no matter what the ground penetrating radar said. For example, ground penetrating, so we get, here's a tray of washed up material from some of these features. There's all kinds of stone tool making debris, and then there's we grabbed gallons and gallons and gallons of the black soil from these features and screened it on window mesh screening in the lab. And this is a close-up. This is 1 millimeter mesh screening. This is what you have in your screens you put in for the summertime, keep the mosquitoes out. So anything that's bigger than that stays behind. And this is all little fish bone and other all the white parts are animal bone. And there's a piece of, there's another one of those salmon vertebra, salmon backbone fragments, and so forth. So each one of these samples from each feature is a time capsule, and the radiocarbon dates will tell us whether or not this area was used for a short period of time or reused over the full 4,000 years, as seems likely. And now I am going to turn it over to Leith, and he's going to tell you about his success with historic archaeology.
As Art has clearly demonstrated,
You're going to have to speak up.
as Art has clearly stated, the results of the GPR were very disappointing, and I just want to try to point.
You can use a mic if you prefer, Leith.
Okay, there we go. Is that better?
Turn it on so there's a green light on it.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay. This is all the upper terrace or upper field where we were working. Is that working all right? Is it? Yeah, it seems like it's coming through. Double. Turn it off. Yeah. All right. I will try to speak. Try to speak loudly. Oops. Okay. Plow scars were what we found in that block excavation. Unfortunately, no evidence of any kind of historic structures, which was the big hope. However, we did get some clues to the historic occupation in the form of some artifacts. What we have here, and I'll just point out a few things, these two pieces of ceramic were very badly burned, but very likely Chinese export porcelain, typically of the 18th century, so 1700s. We obviously have lithics up there on the upper terrace as well. We have lead glazed redware, which are kitchenwares. There's a piece of window glass here hiding in the dark. A very nice wrought spike with a spatulate end. So this is a hand wrought nail prior to 1795. I'll bring your attention to these two little pieces up here. It's tin glazed earthenware, made in Holland or England. This is a posset pot, the kind of vessel that would have been represented by those little pieces. And then point out this little piece here. It's white salt glazed stoneware made between about 1720 and 1780. The tin glaze dates from the mid-1600s all the way up to the end of the 1700s. So that's the little edge on that little tiny piece of ceramic would have been a little tea bowl that would have looked very much like this. So no features, however, these few little fragments that came out of that area, and there was very little material, still gave us a handle on the types of materials that are being used in that area by the historic occupation and rough time periods, basically 18th century, possibly 17th century, and potentially a little bit in the 19th century. Also brought to our attention from one of the earlier collectors who collected materials in the field was this Carlos IV 8-real piece that Ed had told us about, and dated 1793. This is what it would have looked like. It's a half coin, meaning the coin's cut in half, which was very common in those days. The term a bit or 2 bits. These coins had such value that they were frequently cut or broken into pieces and used as tender in that way. So again, here's another dated example of when the historic occupation is existing on site. While we were working on the big block area, in the background, in the background, sorry, this thing is trying to, hold on, I'm just going to use this. There we go. There's an extension of the woods line just north of this area that stuck out into the field. During our initial walkover, I had noticed in those, just inside the trees, there were some stone foundations and what looked like possibly sort of an earthen barn ramp. So that basically told me there was a good chance that there were historic remains in that area. Also, where the woods are, it's the highest area of elevation. Again, indicating that's where you're going to have the greater likelihood of historic occupation. So as the block excavation was closing up, we decided to move up to the woods line, essentially, to test in those areas to look for areas of more evidence of objects, of artifacts, but also still hoping to maybe get some indication of buildings that may have been on the site. Just quick review. We first put in just a whole series of units up along the tree line, starting where this potential barn ramp was, and then focused west of there between the river and the barn ramp. Here we are. We've laid out units. There's a unit here in the foreground, and our first unit right here. We came down. One of the first things we noticed actually was the soil was quite different from out in the field. We had this nice yellowy brown soil, whereas out in the field we came right down under the plow zone on that sort of olivey gray clay. So this was an intact B horizon, which immediately told us the plowing had not been as deep in this area, so there was a greater likelihood of the preservation of features. Right off in our first pit, we found a rectangular area of dark soil. We excavated that out about 2 inches and found a post hole, a very nice post hole right underneath that. Excavating it out a little more, we found a hole that was dug, and then the round post was set into it. We sectioned the post. It went down about 1 foot into the ground and was set on stones. What we think this is actually a post that would have been under the floor of a building. That rectangular area that was sitting above it was probably a thick board, 2-inch plank that was set on top of that post, and then a joist a floor joist then would have been set on that. So essentially that board would have been between the top of the post and the joist. This is very common in buildings in the 18th and 19th century, just to keep the floors and portions of the building up off the ground. So this is not a wall post that would have extended up much higher. So in finding that, obviously it was very exciting. We had actually a real feature, a historic feature. We then moved to the east and to the west, expecting that if there's structures in this area, hopefully they were aligned perpendicular to the river or even with the river. We first moved to the east and found only a stain from a tree root, and then moved to the west. And there's a couple recognizable faces here. Started excavating out a few units and immediately started hitting a bunch of stones. You can see on the tarp back here. As Art has pointed out, there are very few stones, big stones in the fields here. There are very few, and so this was a real anomaly. So we stopped immediately pulling the stones and decided on our last day of excavation, all right, we have to uncover the stones, just remove the soil and leave all the stones in place because we want to see, do they represent anything? Of course, there was grumbling because we were on the edge of a field and there was a possibility that all this was a pile of stones left there by various generations of farmers getting stones out of the fields. However, we had to try to see what might be present. So by the end of the day, this is what we had exposed. It's basically a layer, 1 to 2 layers of stones covering an area. The interpretation right now is there's a very good likelihood that it's a chimney base of some kind. Obviously, what we were able to open up was very limited. And here, just of those 3 units, here was our post hole right here, the tree root and plow scars, and then here's our area, our feature 2 with the stones. So immediately in trying to interpret these stones, the question is, okay, can you create any kind of indication of the chimney base or a firebox that would have been in that chimney? Or is it just a pad that would have been in a very simple structure with just a hole in the roof? You know, because you have no idea what the kind of structure might have been like. So I tried to put a chimney base, in this area, very unsuccessfully, I feel. But anyway, it was my only attempt based on what we had open. Hopefully someday in the future we might be able to open up a little more. All right. We did find more artifacts in this area, so that was very rewarding. And I'll just point out a few things here. And the nails that are here are all hand-wrought nails. The nails on this side are cut nails. Cut nails come in around 1795 in Maine. They don't come in until a little later sometimes, especially up in the willywags in this area. We have window glass, lots of brick bits all over the place. Lead glazed redware again, kitchenwares, utilitarian wares, food processing, a little piece of stoneware, a piece of bottle glass. What I'm going to bring your attention to here is some pearlware, and then these little pieces are bits of what we call creamware. This is what those vessels, if you saw them whole, would have looked like. So again, you're thinking, okay, you've got people living in pretty much in the wilderness. The pearlware on the left is made from about 1775 to 1830. The creamware as early as 1762 to 1820. So you're talking latter 18th and very early 19th centuries. Back to the artifacts, these 2 pieces of pearlware with a little bit of what we call polychrome painted decoration. Again, these are the kinds of vessels those would have represented. So these are what people on the site were actually using. These are just drinking tankards, hand-painted. During lunchtime, while we were up there, instead of just sitting eating lunch, as I often do, I kind of wander around walking the woods line, looking to see if I could see any other indications of stone walls. and found this little piece of gray stoneware, turned it over, and found the blue bands on it. This was exciting because this is German stoneware, typically from the Westerwald region of Germany, and it dates from basically the latter 1600s all the way up to the end of the 1700s. And it was very commonly used to make tankards or mugs similar to this. So here we have another good indication of the time period of when people are there. All right, we were very fortunate in that the Friends of Merry Meeting Bay provided enough funding for us to do some documentary research, including a search of the titles for the property. And we started off with, here's the lot that we actually started off with. Here are the fields where we were working, the northern edge of the field, and the woods. What was very rewarding, first, just looking at the property lines, and this is from the town tax maps, is this long lot actually incorporated the north end of the field and the woods, which was exactly where I had predicted that the early historic occupation would have been located. We were also fortunate in that there's been a recreation of the early lots starting in 1752 by the Plymouth Company. The lots were laid out at that time. In 1753, a year later, they rewarded to Amos Paris here 2 lots, 2 20-acre lots, and it was these 2 lots, 14 and 42. Now this, I'm just so you're not confused, this lot here is represented by this lot here. All right, this is Route 128, and then of course the river here. What was interesting is that, and this was very common at that time, when Amos was awarded that land, he was required in 7 years to build a house 18 feet by 18 feet. It often would be 18 by 20 feet, and also clear 5 acres of land, 5 acres of land that was suitable for tillage or the growing of fine English grass. So by 8 years, Amos was rewarded by then the Kennebec proprietors, and they gave him this parcel, our parcel. And so he receives that I know you're only supposed to put like 3 or 4 points on a slide. However, this is the last slide, just to give you an idea of what the research of the results of the title search were. Here we have Amos up here. As early as 1753, he may have built his house on our parcel closer to the river, because the river was the highway. At that time, Route 128 barely existed. It would have been a paper road. So there's a very good chance he built closer to the river. And then he was awarded, actually, our parcel, which was of 30 acres after that. He only then stays there a year longer. Abile Lovejoy, and you remember on the topographic map, Lovejoy's Narrows, that's the time period of that name and has stuck to the area, is from the 1760s and 1770s, so it's quite interesting in that sense. Abile Lovejoy, this got messed up again. Anyway, he was there for 16 years. And then you basically just get an idea of the different people who were present there. You also can, based on the ceramics that we're finding on the site, assign different people who might have been using those ceramics from the latter 1700s and early 1800s. I'm just going to point out one thing that was kind of interesting. Nathaniel Brown here was on the property. I'm sorry this table got messed up somehow, but he owned the land for five years. He sold the land to Ezra Taylor, the next owner. At some point, Nathaniel probably met Peter Lemercier and decided, and Peter Lemercier needed a really good farm or messuage and land. Nathaniel knew of some. He went to Ezra, purchased the land from Ezra for 400 pounds and then sold it to Peter Lemercier for 500 pounds. So in one day, he made a 100-pound profit. And then, actually, I'm sorry, it doesn't show, this got messed up, but anyway, the Hoodlets are right at the bottom. The Hoodlet family that actually sold the property to the Archaeological Conservancy take ownership around 1890 and then continue on. The Goodwin family, they're on the land for almost 100 years. However, by the time they take ownership, it's in the 1820s or the latter part, and I think at that point there are agricultural buildings on our site, but they basically moved their dwelling to Route 128, because by that time the road systems have been well established. And I think that's about it.
Well, you can understand we had some success, despite the fact that the ground penetrating radar didn't help a lot. We'll take 2 or 3 questions. After that, we brought some artifacts to look at. They're right next to the cookies and drinks. And Leith and I will stay up here, and people can come up and talk to us.